tax is occupying a lot of the headlines around the election. Actually, when you look at the two main parties, they're not that far apart at all, really.
Yeah, it's not completely obvious at the moment that things are going to add up, whoever is in charge.
If you are going to go should we call it the American route, it pays to do that with a very big bazooka. But we just don't have the scale or wherewithal to do that.
Remove as many of the tweaks as possible. I know you're all tax experts and you like all the different bits, but for most people, the simpler it is, the better.
Simplicity in the tax system. What a novel idea.
Right, Sharon, it's general election time, isn't it? Finally, it seems like we've been waiting. Well, we have been waiting almost 5 years for it, and this is like a proper general, not a snap general election, a proper general election. So what better opportunity than this to have a podcast?
Absolutely, yeah. And we're really fortunate to have David and Yael with us. David Gauke is Head of Public Policy at Macfarlanes law firm. But obviously prior to that, you had a very big career in government as a Treasury Minister. And then we've got Yael Selfin, who's our Chief Economist here at KPMG in the UK.
Yeah, who needs no introduction, of course. Well known to anyone who watches anything that comes out of KPMG, budgets, manifesto, hopefully next week, etc., and on the telly all the time. If I could start with you, actually, Yael. The economy, that's sort of been the big theme coming into the election, and particularly is there any money left, and which way are things looking? Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the future? In a nutshell, what's going on at the moment?
Well, the big achievement that the government is going to portray, and is probably not really down to the government so much, but it's still big news, is the fact that inflation has gone down quite significantly. So we were all suffering from much higher inflation due to the energy shocks that we had earlier on. That is really getting back towards a target relatively quickly, although there's a certain element of it that are still sticky. And what it means is that we are expecting interest rates to start going down as well, which is another very good news. But it may take a little bit longer than what we expected earlier. So things could be a little bit more volatile in the short term. But generally, these are two very big news for most of our clients.
Which makes me wonder why they didn't wait a little bit longer to see those numbers coming down. Was there any sort of downside risk of waiting longer later into the year? Well,
I think David will probably be able to have his views on that. From an economics perspective, there's obviously a few other things. I mean, the good news are baked in already, but then you have the issue with public finances and the fact that there's not that much money left for the Chancellor to be able to hand out a few more gifts. Potentially a little bit less than what he had expected earlier on, given the way things are going, which means that it's better to end here rather than drag it and not be able to give any more.
And on that point about election timing, look, I think you can make an argument to say that a few more months of perhaps the economy recovering and people feeling a bit better, living standards starting to rise, might help. But look across the Atlantic, where the American economy has been doing pretty well. It doesn't appear to have helped Joe Biden very much at all. So there's quite a lag, I think, between inflation coming down and people sort of feeling grateful to the government for it, whether that was going to happen at all. Personally, I think the reason he's gone earlier is less to do with economics. I think it was more to do with the fear over the small boats policy. He thought that the summer was going to be dominated by that. What happens with Rwanda? Does he have to kind of go against the European Court of Human Rights, or doesn't he? Or if the policy was operated and people were still coming over. So not everything is about economics, and I think the timing here is not really economic. Yes. Sorry to break it to you. But I think this was more driven by Rwanda and small boats than it was driven by the state of the economy. Because actually there was a case for delaying a bit. I just think it probably wasn't that conclusive.
And Yael, what are some of the longer term strategic economic challenges that we're going to face after the election?
Well, I mean, For a start, I think the good thing about the timing is that we will get a little bit more clarity, and that will help us a little bit with the longer term challenges that we have, because hopefully that will help us with greater support for business investments, greater clarity for public sector as well, and I'm sure we will touch on that a little bit later in terms of planning for investment planning for the years ahead, which will hopefully get us to a better place when it comes to productivity. Productivity is still one of the biggest challenges for us. Even when we think about the potential more favorable technology backdrops that we have, we still need to see that in the numbers in terms of strong productivity, stronger overall growth. We're expecting relatively weak growth for the UK, overall 0.5 this year, only 1% next year, and not much of an upside until we see improvement there.
Yeah, and the decision as to what to spend that short money on, I suppose, is I can't wait too much after the election. So you've been in government, I think, on both sides of spending reviews, a big deal, and there's one due in this December, so not that long after the election. What's it like on the ground? How does this work? I think the impression we get as lay people is this is departments go to the Treasury, ask for everything, Treasury tells them, no, you can't have it. But what's it like in reality? Well,
there's a certain element of truth in that, to be fair. Yes, you're right. I've been Chief Secretary, not during a spending review, but these processes are always ongoing. And I've been a spending minister, both with HMRC and in other departments, Justice and DWP. It's a really important moment, the spending review. Essentially what it is when the government ideally puts their heads together and works out not just the finances, not just the spending in a department, but that should also happen at the same time as you work out exactly what the department is about, what the priorities are, what they're not. And there's an interesting decision for a new government to make as to whether they rush into a spending plan, a spending review that essentially takes effect April next year for a number of years. And they're going to have to make these decisions quite quickly when you've got new, inexperienced ministers still finding their way around their departments. Or do you say, well, actually, we'll roll over for the first year and then have a proper look at everything that government does and come up with something more strategic? And there are arguments either way for that. But yeah, this is a sort of big, important moment. If there'd been an autumn election, I really don't think there'd have been time for a proper spending review to start off in April 25. But they've got a little bit more time. Whether it's enough time, I personally think I'd lean towards rolling over for a year and then doing the job properly and coming up with a 3-year plan after that.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you want to come into government having persuaded the people who are voting for you that you've got a really clearly worked out plan, costed plan, long term, etc. But you haven't had the civil service to help you with any of that until you land, have you?
Absolutely. So I went from, I was an opposition frontbencher and then went into government. And I was part of the George Osborne Shadow Treasury team, which was one of the most well-funded, well-developed shadow teams that we'd ever seen up to that point. But it was still basically 6 or 7 people. And then you go in and as a junior minister, you've got a private office who are 6 or 7 people. You know, the scale is completely different. And I do think that the Labour opposition, I mean, there is a lot of criticism for them being pretty vague and not setting out lots of details. But one defence of it, and I think it's a reasonable case here, is that if you make detailed policy in opposition, then you go in, then you've got the civil service machine there, you've got an ability to consult more widely, and it's a different world. And then you're suddenly left, and most oppositions at some point or other been in this position where you're suddenly left with lots of policies that looked great in opposition, and then you get into government and they don't really work. And then you have to either implement a bad policy or drop a bad policy, and neither is ideal. So I think there's an element at which Labour are thinking, let's not be too specific about these things because, we'd want to wait and see what actually it looks like when we've got the civil service on our side.
Where both of the main parties have been quite specific is that they have said they're not going to put up the rates of the main workhorses of the tax system, so income tax, VAT and national insurance. And I guess I've got two questions around that. Were they wise to do that? And how do they square this circle? Because we've heard about the pressure on the public finances after the election. How do they work that through when they've made such a big commitment?
Well, I think were they wise breaks into two questions. Were they politically wise? Were they economically wise? So politically, there's huge pressure to do that. And if one of the big parties rules it out and the other one doesn't, then you can see what the line of attack is going to be. But, stepping back for a moment, you look at the state of the public finances, unless growth surprises on the upside and tax receipts surprises on the upside, we are in a pretty difficult position. Jeremy Hunt's current spending plans penciled in pretty tough, particularly for the unprotected departments. So this is going to involve, real terms cuts for some departments. We're already, pretty well up on the limits of our debt rules. So it's hard to see that we can borrow much more. And that really leaves you with increasing taxes. But if you want to raise serious sums of tax, you have to make use of your big tax levers. And they're essentially the taxes on income, the taxes on consumption, VAT. And at the moment, both parties have essentially ruled that out, other than what is already baked into the system, which is a very substantial increase in personal taxation because the thresholds are frozen and, whoever's in power, that is going to carry on. But, looking at the numbers, it looks as if we may need more tax revenue or it's going to be a, pretty tough spending round coming up.
Yeah.
And that's based on forecasts, which, I know you've got your views on the accuracy of the OBR forecasts and the assumptions, some of the assumptions they make, because I suppose in reality things could be better or worse, couldn't they? There are sort of particular issues with the way that Treasury forecasts are done at the moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the OBR is using government stated policy, which we know is not always likely to be carried out. So probably they are on the optimistic side, but it is also possible that the actual fiscal rule will be adjusted. So, for example, they will be able to borrow to invest, or however you define that. So I think there will be more borrowing. So it will not all be financed by higher taxes. They will need to borrow more and then just try and adjust the rules to accommodate that.
And in terms of the debt rule, because that's the one that's sort of biting at the moment, so that debt is falling in the fifth year of the forecast.
Yeah, which is not a great rule. Anyway.
It's not a great rule. No, I think everyone accepts it's not a great rule, but it is it's the one that bites at the moment. I mean, there are some things that a new government could do out there in terms of sort of, I think, Bank of England liabilities. You will know better than I do, but it's still quite tight. There's nothing that makes it very easy for them to borrow vast sums more.
Yes,
there's some.
These would not be vast, Sam. I absolutely agree with you, but it does give them a little bit more leeway. But ultimately, I'm not expecting a major increase in spending as a result of that. So they will be fairly constrained.
So we've got no major increase in the amount of debt that we can take out. No big commitments to increase spending, but a few sort of smaller ones. All of the big revenue raises, unless I've missed one for tax, essentially been ruled out. No rises, and so we've got a bit of fiscal drag. We've got the fiction of fuel duty escalator being reinstated, which never happens. I suppose that's why, from what it looks like, we've got some quite sort of minor tweaky type tax proposals that have come out of the main parties, really quite conservative on what they're promising, what they're not promising.
Yeah, it's not completely obvious at the moment that things are going to add up, whoever is in charge. And there is a bit of talk that Rachel Reeves will come in and then she'll say, I've looked at the books and they're much worse than we previously realised, and hence we are going to do something that we promised not to do, but this is the responsible thing to do. And she may well do this, but we haven't had a change of government since the Office for Budget Responsibility was put in place. And the idea that there's a sort of set of books that you open up and then things are different. So I was in the Treasury in 2010, and Alistair Darling had done a budget in March, and we came in May. And then the numbers that the Treasury presented to us actually were worse than the numbers that were being took by and large. I mean, it's complicated, but by and large, they were worse than we had previously been told they were. And that gave us perhaps more room to do things like put up VAT. But when Rachel Reeves comes into office, assuming that's what's going to happen, which looks highly likely, it's a bit different, because these are going to be, the OBR won't have changed. The OBR assumptions won't have changed. She's going to be working off the same numbers. And yes, by the time she gets around to doing a budget in the autumn, the OBR's numbers may have changed, but they are an independent body. And, I think it's going to be hard for her to say, oh, we didn't know anything about this. It's politically going to be more difficult.
Unless the economy is very different. I suppose that's the unknown a bit, isn't it? But there's not that long to.
Well,
much time
hopefully
to
it's
lapse.
not worse than what it is. I mean, you could have shocks, and we're expecting more volatility going forward, but the way things are, we're not expecting any major deterioration in the economy. And normally when you do have a deterioration in the economy, what you do is spend more, not the other way around.
We've heard a lot in the media over the last few weeks around personal taxes, but I wondered if we should focus a little bit more on business taxes, because actually over the last decade or so, we've seen quite a change in government policy on tax anyway. So Tim, I don't know if you want to just remind us of what's been happening.
There's been a bit of a volte-face, I would say, in certainly in the approach to corporate income tax and to UK competitiveness, and what sort of, because obviously in the world of corporate taxes, you're always weighing up revenue raising on the one hand. All the advantages of corporate tax are they raise revenue. They're also a way of raising revenue without hitting voters, or at least not directly, versus then not wanting to do something that undermines the competitiveness of the UK economy, and potentially doing things that actually push competitiveness of the UK and push for FDI. We've seen how that can work spectacularly well in Ireland, for example. Now, I can remember for many years, and certainly during the coalition years and a couple of years after, certainly until the Brexit vote, there was a core philosophy in UK corporate tax, which is we want a low, stable, or relatively low, stable headline rate, and then we'll have quite a broad base. There were a number of things that were done to broaden the base, to reduce deductions, etc., because it's that stable rate and the simplicity of it that's going to appeal to investors. But, plus we'll have a patent box, R&D credits, but it was, generally speaking, it was simplicity and predictability. Now, over the last few years, we seem to have gone in an opposite, or a much more American-style direction, where you might have a higher rate and, in theory, a narrower base and more targeted incentives. I think that's certainly the idea behind things like investment zones and free ports. It hasn't quite happened to its fullest extent yet, but we've got full expensing. Do you think is that a philosophical sort of deliberate change, or is it just something that's happened through convenience? And do you think it's something that's likely to continue across either party?
Well, I think we've stumbled into where we are. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I was the Minister for Tax working for George Osborne when we, brought the rates down, and we were very ambitious as to how far we wanted to go on that. And at one point, planned to get it to 17%. As you say, we'd broadened the base. And that's kind of where we wanted to be. Then you had, in the aftermath of the pandemic, government scratching around for money, and then corporation tax rates went up. They argued, well, we hadn't seen the sort of great benefits of a low corporation tax rate. Some of us would argue that Brexit made it very hard to attract all the business investment that we would otherwise have done. And in that environment, yes, maybe it didn't work as much as we had hoped, but that was the environment that was put in place. So anyway, corporation tax rates went up. Then there was a sort of bit of a pushback against that, and then full expensing was introduced. Now, it does appear, looking at the political parties, that things have sort of settled down somewhat. Both parties are saying, well, we're not going to put rates up above 25%. Both are saying, full expensing, we're committed to it. Labour are talking about putting in place a corporate tax roadmap, which is what we did after 2010. I think that's very sensible. And so at least the impression one is getting from Labour at the moment is they don't see this as a great potential kind of cash cow that they're going to go back and try and get more revenue. Rachel Reeves is very keen to encourage more business investment. She does need the economy to grow really to square the circle. Some of these pressures we are talking about will diminish if the economy grows more strongly over the next few years, and getting business investment in is important, and corporation tax is an important part of that. So I think we may see a bit of stability. That's no bad thing. It's not the model that I would prefer. I still prefer the unfashionable, broad-based, low-rate approach myself. But I think perhaps the most important thing is some stability in a system that has not seen it for a little while.
And I suppose if you are going to go the, should we call it the American route, and you're going to have a relatively high rate, of course their rate is the same as ours now, a relatively higher rate but much more targeted incentives, then it pays to do that with a very big bazooka, doesn't it? I mean, they've thrown virtually $1 trillion of tax credits at the Inflation Reduction Act, largely taxed and largely focused on green investment. We just don't have the scale or wherewithal to do that. But it feels like that's really the only way you're going to make that sort of approach work.
I think that's probably right. I mean, certainly what we're hearing from Labour is a lot about industrial strategy. But 2 points, as you say, we're not the US, so there are options that really aren't available to us in terms of scale. The second point is, I'm not sure that we will end up necessarily using the tax system as a way of delivering industrial strategy. In a way, I hope not. I'm not sure that tax is always the best way, in which if you're going to go down the industrial strategy route, there might be better ways of doing it. We could do with a little bit more detail when Labour talks about industrial strategy. Exactly how is that going to work? They've stepped away from the Green Prosperity Plan, at least the £28 billion a year version of it.
But none of that was tax either, was it?
No, exactly.
It was all subsidy, essentially.
So we'll see exactly how they want to pursue it. But we should be clear, this is likely to be a more interventionist and activist government that is going to be, if you like, picking winners, picking particular sectors that it's going to want to support. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be greater complication in the tax system because, as you say, you could do this through other means.
Yeah.
It's strange, actually, because although tax is occupying a lot of the headlines around the election, actually, when you look at the two main parties, they're not that far apart at all, really, either personal taxes or corporate taxes. And the other similarity that they both have is that they're both going after tax avoidance and trying to close the tax gap. And obviously, those are quite nebulous figures sometimes. What's your experience of trying to close the tax gap? How effective do you think some of the policies that are being talked about will be?
Well, I'm quite amused by this sometimes. I mean, there was a radio report the other day, and I always thought that the newsreader sort of did this deliberately. They sort of announced a policy. I can't remember if I think it was Conservative, and this is going to be paid for by tackling tax avoidance. Then the Liberal Democrats announced their policy, and this is going to be paid for by tackling tax avoidance. It's slightly wearisome because it sort of seems to be the root of all funding. It is absolutely right that the government takes this seriously. Actually, over the last 14 years, I would say this when I was responsible for the first 6 years, I think quite a lot of progress was made in terms of tackling tax avoidance and tax evasion. The point that isn't really made in this sort of wider debate is where is the money? Because I think quite a lot of people listening to this assume, right, this is all going to be tackling big corporates and the very, very wealthy. If you look where the tax gap is, it's small businesses. It's the plumber accepting cash in hand and things like that. As a politician, you get into huge trouble if you point that out. But as an ex-politician, I can say that. That's where the real money is. And if you are going to do something about it, actually the people affected, who are going to be more heavily scrutinised, who are maybe going to be pursued more aggressively, will notice it. It's not entirely a kind of political free lunch. There will come a point, I can sort of guarantee it, is that there will be groups of taxpayers or perhaps non-taxpayers, but people who should be paying tax, who are suddenly sort of outraged that there is some policy that is getting money out of them, and they're thinking, well, I'm not a big, US, tech company, or I'm not some, enormously wealthy non-dom. Why are you pursuing me? The reality is, the tax gap is largely made up of lots of people paying a little bit less than they should, not a small number of people, not paying vast amounts of money.
Yeah, so true.
And certainly in the election period, and it would be interesting to see how then sensitive the main party, maybe it depends on the outcome of the election, but how sensitive the main parties are on upsetting groups of voters. I can imagine us continuing this sort of strange situation we're in at the moment, where tax rises are fine, and public opinion says tax rises are fine to pay for improved services or to keep up with military spending, etc. But tax rises on other people, ideally on people who have nothing to do with us and we don't know in our social group. And it seems that we're sort of stuck in a bit of that rut at the moment, which I think if I were in a large business, and particularly in a sector where there's a feeling that they should pay their way, etc., I would be looking out for further changes over the next couple of years. Things that where I'm easy pickings.
Yeah, and what we shouldn't forget is there is talk about reforming business rates, and Labour looking to do that. Again, no real plan set out, but how are they going to do that? Again, I confess I've looked at ways in which you can reform business rates. Is quite difficult, and there's no easy consensus on an alternative, and it raises quite a lot of money. But that is one for some big companies. Clearly the intention is that they are going to be paying more, and your high street shop is going to be paying less. But what that actually means in practice really remains very unclear.
Because then we get on to taxes that have a dual purpose, don't they? They're there to raise revenue potentially, but they're also there to nudge behaviour or to level playing fields in markets and so on. This is probably an impossible question to answer. Yeah, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What evidence is there out there for the ability of tax and sort of mega tax policies to actually have a real influence on economic outcomes? Is it fairly slim, or is it just it's too complex to boil down in 1 minute?
Yeah, I mean it is difficult to boil down in 1 minute, but I'd say there's two elements to think about. One is when you do increase the price of something, you change behavior. So it does have an impact this way, but then the other thing you need to think about is whether it's a temporary thing or permanent thing. Because if it's something, if you think about, for example, investment zone is a good example where you potentially displace activity from one area to the other, and then the big question is once you withdraw that, what happens in that area, whether you manage to create something that is sustainable and long lasting, or whether it just goes back to what it was before. So those are the key things to look out for.
It's kind of difficult for the forecasts as well, because when you're forecasting the fiscal impact of a new tax policy, it's almost impossible to forecast the behavioural impact of that. It might bring in less money than you expected to, or it might bring in more money if it's an incentive that increases economic activity. I
mean, you know very well that when you think, especially on businesses, it's not just the price. And it's not just a tax that would influence investment decisions. A lot of it is about certainty. It's about the overall environment. So I'd say in that sense, there's definitely other things that would impact the overall economic outlook. It's not just a tax element.
Yeah. Tim, just to sort of follow up on how a new government might use the tax system to pursue other policies. I mean, we've not really heard anything in the course of this election campaign, at least that I've picked up, about things like carbon taxes or sugar taxes. So I was involved in the soft drinks industry levy. Now, I don't see any government, whilst there is still, real cost of living pressures in play, looking to extend, for example, the sugar tax. But maybe a year or two down the line, if the economy is picking up, if the pressure on living standards is being reduced, and there's a real push, for example, to reduce obesity, might they have different plans on, for example, applying it to particularly sugary foods, confectionery and so on. So, that is one to look out for. And again, climate change hasn't been a big part of this general election campaign so far. But if we're really serious about this, then carbon taxes, do have to come into play. There's obviously movements with carbon border adjustment mechanisms and, what the EU does, et cetera, et cetera. Is that something that, not for today, no one's talking about it in this election campaign, but a couple of years down the line, could that start to become a live debate? I think that's certainly worth looking out for.
I do. This is one of those areas where I do wonder sometimes whether the minor parties can propose taxes or tax changes that the other two will poo-poo to start with, but they sort of hang around, and if they see that they've gone down quite well, they might come in. It was interesting looking at the only manifesto as of today that is out is the Lib Dem one, and they have a few of those sort of tweaky type taxes that are looking to nudge behaviour. And you're right, it's another one of those dogs that hasn't really barked, and probably for the reason you say that it's not on brand with a cost of living election, but there's been a lot of that sort of tinkering that politicians have done recently, isn't there?
Yeah, now is not the time to put. If you're in favour of these taxes, now is not the time to push them. But in a couple of years' time, things might change.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, David, before we closed, was if you magically woke up on the 5th of July and found that you'd been appointed Chancellor, what would be your big tax idea?
Well, I suppose it's quite tempting to say I wouldn't start from here, but. Notwithstanding the Labour pledge, and it's difficult because they've said this, but if you want to raise serious sums of money, you do, as I said earlier, have to use the big levers. Nick Macpherson, who was permanent secretary in the Treasury for most of my time there, has said, is it worth looking again at the sort of health and social care levy? It's a third tax on income, which is not great from a perfect design of the tax system. But down the line, if you're going to say, look, we do need to find more revenue, the fairest way of doing this is by taxing on income. We can do this progressively. We can raise quite a lot of money. I think more modelled on income tax than national insurance contributions in the way that Rishi Sunak did in Boris Johnson in 2021. But I think that, if you're looking for a big chunk of money, rather than trying to find bits and pieces here and there where you're likely to provoke quite a big behavioural response, I think, in some of the things that they're looking at, I do wonder whether a big broad-based tax, and yes, you will be criticised for this is contrary to the spirit of what Rachel Reeves has said in this election campaign, but I just wonder whether it's worth taking one big hit to bring in 15 billion quid or whatever, 20 billion quid, and that's taking you quite a long way.
And would you hypothecate it?
Well, you present it as a hypothecation because we're going to need to spend more money on health and social care anyway. Hypothecation, by and large, is a bad idea. You should raise taxes the best way and you should spend money the best way, and linking the two is always a bit of a fiction. But the public seem to like it.
Pseudo hypothecation.
Yes, yeah. It's easier to sell new taxes that way. I don't think it's not a good idea, but
Treasury like it.
Treasury is right not to like it, but as a political strategy, it can make. Gordon Brown did this with an increase in NICs, resulted in higher levels of spending on the NHS, and got away with it. And I just wonder whether that's that's the one thing that they might.
Yeah, call it a levy. I was wondering, defence of Ukraine levy, for example, things like that, or armed forces levy, that kind of idea. What would your big idea be? Like overhaul the fiscal rules? What would you do day one?
So I think one thing that is really important is to broaden the tax base. So however you do that, that's really important. Make it much clearer and stable. So maybe saying, okay, this is our plan for the next. I know you do need to change sometimes, but just try and make it as clear and long lasting as possible, and remove as many of the tweaks as possible. I know you're all tax experts and you like all the different bits, but for most people, the simpler it is, the better.
Yeah, to keep
Simplicity in the tax system. What a novel idea.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So I think we're out of time. Great question to end on, though. The big question: what would I do on day one as a chancellor? And we know from the past they like to surprise us sometimes. So yeah, thanks a lot, Yael. Thanks a lot, David, for your time here. Sharon, we're going to be pretty busy the next couple of weeks, aren't we?
Yes, and it's worth just mentioning that we have a manifesto webinar on the 18th of June between 1 and 2, which people can tune in for, or they can watch it on catch up on our website after the event.
And we'll be going into lots of detail on what's in the manifestos and what that means for you or for your business there. So thanks a lot, and we'll wrap it up there.